We're going to go through an example OpenID Connect, also known as OIDC, single sign-on configuration of OpenPages 8203 with IBM ID. In this example, OpenPages and WebSphere Liberty profile, also known as WLP or WebSphere Liberty, act as the service provider, and IBM ID acts as the identity provider. Your setup may differ from the one shown here, but the same general concept should still apply. After we finish setting up and testing OIDC SSO with OpenPages, I'll provide some troubleshooting information. Before we begin, our environment must be set up with the following prerequisites. The IBM ID provider must be set up and running already. This means that we have created an IBM ID registration and it's been provisioned. Secondly, the OpenPages server must be running and working. If this is a new setup, it's typically a good idea to test the OpenPages deployment with the traditional login first to make sure the OpenPages server is working. The final prerequisite is that we need to have matching user accounts set up in IBM ID and OpenPages so that the SSO login can complete successfully. So the IBM ID user OPSSO at ibm.com must also exist in the OpenPages user registry. In order to enable SSO in OpenPages, we need to log on to the OpenPages application as a user with administrative privileges and change some system configuration settings. Using the Task UI, we'll click on the gear icon in the top right, then System Configuration, and then Settings. In the settings, we need to show hidden settings by going to Application, Common, Configuration, and then we can change the Show Hidden Settings value to true. Now that we have the hidden settings visible, we need to enable the OpenPages SSO settings. Still in the settings, we need to go to Platform, Security, Single Sign-On, Implementations, Current, and change the value of that setting to HTTP user-based. In Platform Security Single Sign-On, there are two more settings we need to enable. Both the SOCS and the OP settings need to be set to true. These three settings let the OpenPages application know to treat users as SSO users instead of OpenPages registry users. This is especially important for usability purposes. With those settings enabled, we finish the required changes within the OpenPages application. The configuration will be the same no matter which IDP we use. Now that we've finished with the OpenPages configuration, we need to configure WebSphere Liberty for OIDC SSO. The first step is to install the OpenID Connect client 1.0 feature into Liberty. We do this by opening a terminal session on the OpenPages server where Liberty is running, as I've done here. We're using Linux to run OpenPages for this example. If you're using Windows instead, the process should be similar, but you'll need to look up the equivalent commands. We need to navigate to the OpenPages directory and find the WebSphere Liberty bin directory. In my case, it's my OP home directory /WLP/bin. Once we have the bin directory, we need to run the Liberty install utility tool to install the OpenID Connect client 1.0 feature. This feature is included with the OpenPages install media to allow for installs that don't have access to the internet. Once the OpenID Connect Client 1.0 feature is installed, we need to configure Liberty to use OIDC. We'll go to the server directory within the WLP user dir. In this example, you can see the path that I've highlighted here. We'll use the config drop-ins/overrides directory to override the default configuration and enable OIDC SSO. Within the overrides directory, we need to create a new XML file. The file name can be anything reasonable, but for this example, we'll stick with OPSSO OIDC config.xml, as shown here. We need to add quite a bit of XML config to this file. Please follow along with the video or refer to the OpenPages documentation to copy and paste this text. You may notice that the config file has some entries that need to be corrected to match our deployment. First, we need to give our OIDC configuration an ID. This can be any reasonable string of text. We'll keep it simple in this example and name it OIDC config, as shown. It's important to use the values shown here and in the documentation to start, as they are known to work. Note that the map identity to registry user settings default value is false, but we also explicitly set it to false as previous versions of the OpenPages documentation had it set to a different value. We found that the false setting results in fewer undesired error cases. We also need to configure the client ID, client secret, and discovery endpoint URL attributes. All three of these come from our identity provider, IBM ID in this case. We'll head over to our IBM ID OIDC deployment to grab that information. On the IBM ID OpenID Connect client details page, we can see both the client ID and the client secret near the top. Normally you don't want to reveal the client secret, but for this example, I'll just change my secret once we're done. I've also gone ahead and already set the redirect URI to point at my OpenPages server. The OIDC config at the end matches the ID we set earlier. We also need to fetch the discovery endpoint URL a bit further down on the page. The well-known /OpenID configuration part of the URL should be similar for other identity providers as well. Another important attribute that may differ depending on your setup is the user identity to create subject. We've set this to the preferred username value for this example setup. This value comes from the JSON sent over by the identity provider. If we were using ADFS as the identity provider instead, then we might use UPN as the value for this attribute. We can go to the discovery URL in a browser and inspect the JSON return to see which claims are supported by our provider. There are several options shown here, including preferred username, UPN, UID, and employee ID. Your identity provider may differ here, so it's best to check and make sure you use the right claim. The last important piece of the OIDC configuration is the auth filter. The setup in this example excludes the OpenPages REST API from using OIDC SSO authentication. We define a pattern to match with the URL pattern attribute, and then specify that OIDC will only be used if the URL requested does not contain that pattern. It is possible to configure multiple auth filter elements for an OIDC config, as well as multiple conditions within the same auth filter element. Take care when configuring multiple conditions or multiple filters to make sure that they do not clash with each other. More information on auth filters can be found in the WebSphere Liberty documentation. In addition to configuring the OIDC client in WebSphere Liberty, we need to configure a key store and trust store for our SSL config to use if we don't have them set up already. Since this deployment already has the default key store set up here, we can just reference that. We'll also define a default trust store to point at the same default store, key.p12. We'll save our changes, and then we can move on to importing the root and intermediate certificate authority certificates from IBM ID. I've gone ahead and downloaded the root and intermediate certificates from IBM ID. I've also copied them over to our OpenPages Liberty server so that we can import them into the trust store. Now that we've got the IBM ID certificates, I've put them in the resources/security directory within our Liberty server directory for OpenPages. For example, you can see the directory I've highlighted here. We'll go ahead and import the certificates into our trust store. We're using the default trust store, key.p12 here. If you configured your own trust store, you should use that one instead. Run the following keytool command to import the IBM ID certificates into the trust store. The password for the trust store is the same as the OpenPages administrator password set on install. The trust store password can also be changed after the install. Now that we've set up the OIDC config for WebSphere Liberty, we can restart the OpenPages services using the following commands. Once the OpenPages services have stopped, we can restart them with a similar command with the -- clean flag. This flag is essential after installing a new feature for WebSphere Liberty. Once the OpenPages services are back up, we can try logging in to our OpenPages server with OIDC SSO. If we go to the root OpenPages server, we'll get prompted to log in to IBM ID and will then be forwarded on to the OpenPages application. Once we're sure that OIDC SSO is set up and working, we can go ahead and disable form-based login. Form-based login is what's used for OpenPages authentication when SSO is not enabled, so this is just to ensure all users must authenticate with SSO. We'll once again need to be a user with administrative privileges, and we'll change one last system configuration setting. We need to go to Platform, Security, Form-based Login, Enabled, and change that setting to False. With that setting disabled, our example setup is good to go with OIDC, SSO, and IBM ID. One last note, we recommend setting OpenPages user passwords to never expire when using SSO. More information about making that change can be found linked in the OpenPages OIDC documentation. If your OIDC setup does not work as easily as this demo did, there are a few steps you can take to help with troubleshooting. Back in our OpenPages server directory within the WLP user directory, we can take a look at the logs directory. Within the logs directory, you'll see several console.log as well as messages.log files and some trace.log files. Messages.log can be extremely helpful for determining what went wrong with your OIDC setup. There's also some Aurora tracing that can be turned on. If we go back to the OpenPages Aurora conf directory, and we open up the aurora logging.properties file, we can enable additional login logging. Find the login logger section as shown here and uncomment these 5 lines. This will enable Aurora login tracing. You can also up the level of tracing by finding the login appender section and changing the debug setting to trace. This will log sensitive information such as usernames, so if you do not wish to log those settings, then keep the setting at the debug level instead. These logs will appear in the aurora/logs/debug directory, and you can then use those to help troubleshoot your OIDC setup. You can also see in the OpenPages documentation we have more information on setting user passwords to never expire, as well as more information on enabling that Aurora trace logging I just talked about. One last thing that may be useful is how to get trace files for WebSphere Liberty's OIDC feature. As shown here, you can find the Troubleshoot OpenID Connect WebSphere Liberty page by searching for it. It has all of the settings necessary to enable WebSphere Liberty tracing for OIDC if we go over to the Collect Data tab. This can be especially useful if you're having a problem that can't be determined from looking at the Aurora or messages.log files. It will also be extremely helpful if you're trying to troubleshoot and open a support ticket. That concludes the OpenPages 8203 OIDC SSO demo with IBM ID. Thanks for watching.